Export an image from Photoshop, there's a bunch of different options that we want to look at. And most of these options are relatively straightforward. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. They also change over time. So, a lot of the stuff there's some basics that kind of stay the same, but they could change eventually. But the basic thing we want to do, we've created this image and we're like, okay, this looks good. I want to publish this, or I want to, send it to my friend on Discord, or I want to make this my background on my website, whatever I want to do with this thing. As I mentioned, I can't just use this PSD file. There's a lot of information in here that's not necessary. I do need to save the PSD file so I can go back and edit it later. But one thing that we'll notice, I'm going to open up the Finder window that I have over here. If I go to look at this PSD file, it's almost 7 megabytes. That's not like gigantic, but it's much bigger than a normal image file. If I look at my original source images, this one's 2.7 megabytes, which is actually quite big for an image that's this size, but it's not totally crazy. This lizard is 192 kilobytes. So a megabyte is a million bytes, I think, and a kilobyte is 1,000 bytes. So a kilobyte is smaller than a megabyte by a lot. So 192 kilobytes is pretty good for an image. That will download very quickly. 2.7 megabytes, that's starting to get a little bit too big. That's a little bit bigger than you want. So the thing that determines how big a file is how much information's in there. So the Photoshop file is bigger because it actually has like the original image files. Photoshop actually makes a copy of the images so that if we lose those images, we don't lose our information. That's a setting that you can change, but I'm not going to go into that detail right now. But it also saves information about how many layers we have, the adjustments that we added to those layers, and all the other various things that we've created to make this composition. So what we want to do is create a new image file, so similar to the original images that we used, but that looks like what we see in our Photoshop canvas. So there's a few ways to do that. The easiest way that we're going to go over, we go to File, go to Export, and there's a few options here. Quick export as PNG is like the fastest way to do it. It's not going to ask you too many things, but your image is probably going to be kind of large. So we're going to go to Export As, and we're going to look at a few of the options that are available here. So when I click on Export As, I'm going to get this new dialog window. And this is actually really useful for comparing various different things about my export. So I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Over here, we can see the size of the image. So 124 is the width in pixels, and 768 is the height in pixels. And we can also see how big the file, how much memory the file will take up. So 145 kilobytes, that's actually pretty good. That's smaller than our original source image. That's not so bad. So we're starting off in a good place, but let's see if we can get it even better without sacrificing quality. So I'm going to make this window a little bit larger. One thing that I can do is I can zoom in, and I can see what the quality looks like up close and far away. And so we can see some things will change depending on the various settings that we use. Another thing that's useful in this view is I can put two images next to each other. And so I can change the settings. So I can choose one window or another and change the settings and see what the difference is. So let's zoom in so we can kind of look at some detail a little bit. I'm going to zoom in to 100%. And I'm going to choose the window on the right and then make some changes to the settings. And we'll see how the outcome changes. So I'm going to go from PNG. So a PNG, let's actually look up what PNG stands for because I can never remember. PNG is Portable Network Graphics. And this is a file format that is designed for the internet, and it's designed to be lossless. That means that we don't lose any of the original image data that we started with. So all of the colors that we created when we made our composition will be visible in the exported image. That's good if you want high quality, but it's not good if you want a low file size. So you'll notice there aren't a lot of options here. One option is if I want transparency or not. I don't need transparency, so I can turn that off. And you can see my file size dropped a little bit, and it basically looks the same. So it's like cutting out, basically, if we had transparency, like parts of the image that we could see through, that would take up more space on the computer. But since we don't have any transparency, we can just get rid of that. We can also choose a smaller file, 8-bit. That basically reduces the number of the amount of color information that we can store. Since I use the posterize effect, I don't have a lot of different types of colors in here. So it actually doesn't really change the output very much. There's not a lot of like visible change in detail here. So I can, with an image like this, I can get away with this smaller file. If I had more detail, I might not be able to get away with that. Okay, so that's PNG, and 100 kilobyte PNG is pretty good. I wouldn't probably, if I was actually doing stuff for publishing on the internet on my own right now, I would say 100's good. I'm not gonna bother with this. If I was making like a video game or something like that that had to have a higher performance, I would see, can I squeeze more out of this? So let's switch over to JPEG. JPEG is a different file standard. Let's look up what JPEG stands for real quick. JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts File Interchange Format. Okay. So basically a bunch of like computer programmers got together and created this algorithm to make the image smaller. So one thing you'll notice with the JPEG is that it has this quality slider. Okay, so we can compare, oh actually I want to put this on here. Okay, so we have our PNG original on the left, and we're going to switch this to JPEG. So with the quality up here, it doesn't really look different, right? It looks the same. So let's move the quality down. So notice what happens when I take the quality all the way down. The individual pixels are replaced with these big blocks. So the JPEG image format does different things to make the image simpler for the computer to save in memory, so that it can save data. And look at that, we did save a lot of data. We got down to 47 kilobytes. That's pretty good. But our image does not look like what we want it to look like. So this might not be the right level of quality. So if we move the quality up, if we go all the way up to 7, it looks essentially the same. So that's good. What if we go down to 6? It looks a little bit different. So now the question is it an acceptable amount of difference? But then we can also see over here, this image is actually bigger. This image is 600 kilobytes. So maybe the JPEG compression format isn't the right format for this particular image. And the reason for that is probably because of the color palette that I used. So I'll do another quick demo without the effects, and we'll see the difference. But right now, it's pretty clear that the PNG is a better choice here. So I'm going to go with the PNG, go with smaller file. A couple other options. Let's set this up real quick. So we can change the width and the height here. 1024 is pretty good. I don't really want to play with that too much. I could make it smaller. Like if I knew where this was going, like for example, if I knew that this was going to be like a thumbnail image that was never going to be larger than like 250 pixels, then I would just size it down. I would say, all right, let's go with 256. That looks fine. And now it's going to be really, really small because there's not that much going on there. Okay, so when we size things down, we never want to size things up. If you size things up, you're going to lose the detail in the image. So we want to avoid doing that. But we can size things down, and we can keep the same level of detail, even though the image is smaller. It takes up more space, so we just compress those details. When we size something, though, we have some option about how to do it. The default is probably fine, but let's take a look at some of the other options. So one of the other options is nearest neighbor. Bicubic basically means it's looking at all the different color data and it's choosing what it thinks the right color to put there is. If we do nearest neighbor, this is going to do a different algorithm that chooses different colors. And so you can see the difference the nearest neighbor, the all the pixels are very flat and square, versus the bicubic, it kind of like fades the pixels into each other. Again, since we're working with a limited palette, the difference is not quite as dramatic, but we'll look at a different type of palette in a second. So I'm going to scale this back up to 100%. I'm fine with that. And I'm happy with 107 kilobytes, so I'm good with this. And there's a couple other options here we do not need to worry about. So I'm just going to click export. And so now this is going to bring up my export window. You may see this, and if you do, that's fine. You can choose the folder you want from here, but usually I'll click on this drop down, and I'm going to go to my project folder. So I'm going to go to desktop, MMP 100, self-portrait, and self-portrait.png. If I want to put some more info in here, like export, 1 or something like that, if I'm going to do multiple ones of these, you can do that. As long as it has a different file name, it'll save. So then I just click save here. And now if I look in my Finder, you can see there's that image. And so I can put this image on OpenLab. I can text this image to somebody. I can put it on Discord. That's something you could do if you're working on your composition and you want to get a little feedback from me or another student before you submit. You could put it in the MMP 100 channel. So I could drag this on here, click upload, and say, what do you think of my composition? And so people will be able to see it here. If I try to upload a PSD, it's not gonna, well actually it might let me upload it, but it's not gonna preview. It's just a file. Discord doesn't know what to do with this because it's not Photoshop. So that's fine if you want to share a file, but it's not a final image that can be shared the way a PNG or a JPEG can be. Okay, I'm going to delete this because we don't need it here. Okay, so I mentioned that the color palette is really affecting how we see this. So let's go back to our gradient map, which has a lot more color detail in there. The posterize is reducing all the colors to just 4 different colors. But if I just have my gradient map effect, you can see there's a lot more colors, especially if we zoom in. You can see there's a lot of different colors because we're fading in between different colors. There's a lot more detail, or at least color detail. So let's see what our export options look like now. So I'll go to File, go to Export, go to Export As. See, now our image file size to begin is much larger. It's 500 kilobytes just to start, because there's a lot more color information here. Okay, so let's go to our 2-up window and play around with how it looks a little bit. So I'm going to zoom into 100%. So there's some detail. Okay, let's see how this changes. So if I change smaller file, so look at that. If I turn off smaller file, I go all the way up to 1 megabyte. So that's over twice as big. So 1 megabyte is twice as much as 500 kilobytes. Okay, so 1 megabyte is much bigger. It's not like so big that I can't put it on Discord, but it's bigger than I want my image to be. So let's see if we can actually see the difference between these two images. One over here is 500K, over here 1 megabyte. If I zoom in, can I tell the difference? I really can't tell the difference. At least my eyes can't. Maybe yours can. So I don't really know what I'm getting with that extra 500 megabytes. So I definitely don't want to use that. So I'm not getting any quality out of that. So I'm just going to go with the smaller file, and that's fine. Okay. And there's not that much else I can change with the PNG. So if I wanted to get something smaller than 500, I'm going to leave my PNG here for reference. I'm going to zoom in, and let's take a look at our JPEG options. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit. So you can see there's a little bit of difference here, but it's not significant because the quality is set to high. And the file size for the JPEG is actually bigger in this case than the PNG. The JPEG is 924, the PNG is 500. So let's turn the quality down a notch. Okay, so now the JPEG is suddenly less than the PNG, but I don't notice much change in quality. Let's see if we can see the difference. I really don't notice. Let's zoom in more and see if we can tell. So we can look at certain features and see if they change. So we do see that there's less color information in here. What? The lighter purple area, that means like spread more to reduce the quality. Right. So it's changing the number of colors, and so certain colors are taking up more space. Exactly. So if I go all the way down to low, now I just have these big, gross blocks, and it looks bad zoomed in, and it also looks pretty bad zoomed out. So this is not an acceptable quality level, but maybe 6 is. And maybe even 5 is. I can't really see the difference there, especially if we were seeing this zoomed out a little bit. It looks pretty much the same. And 5 is 200 kilobytes. That's pretty good. What if I go down to 4? I can start to see, when you start to see the changes, that's called artifacts. It's called artifacts of the compression algorithm. And I can see some artifacts here. Like, look at these buildings where there's like a big color here. Do you see the artifacts where suddenly there's these squares? So if I go up a little bit, then we see less of those artifacts. If I go down a little bit, we start to see them come back. Okay, so we just want to find something that's acceptable quality but low file size. And so I'm happy with this JPEG here. And now let's look at the resizing again. So let's say we wanted to scale this down to 50%. So we know that the biggest version of this is not going to be that big. So let's see what happens when we choose a different algorithm. So we have a lot of detail in this. If I change this to nearest neighbor, we see that the pixel detail changes. So this is the default, and this is nearest neighbor. So there's not really one that's best. Photoshop will kind of give you some recommendations. You can play around with them. I usually tend to just go with the defaults unless there's like a very specific look that I'm going for. I'm not going to spend a lot of time playing around with these unless I'm either not getting the quality I want, or I'm not getting the file size I want, or if I have a very specific goal for the look of the image. So let's set this back to 100%. And so I think I'm good with the 200 kilobytes for my JPEG. I'm going to click export and download this. So I'll say self-portrait. This is export 2. And so now I have export 1, export 2 with different effects. And so you might say, why are these different? Why do we have these different image compression formats? There's basically, we have this problem that we want to be able to show images on lots of different devices. It's better if the images have a small file size because it is faster to download and it's easier to distribute, but it's bad if the image quality suffers. And different people basically have different ways of fixing that problem. And they have different what's called a compression algorithm, which is basically a program that reads through all the information in your image and decides how much of it to save, or, depending on the algorithm, what information to get rid of to reduce the file size. And so JPEG is generally good for images with a lot of detail, for photographs and things like that. PNG tends to be better for things that have a lot of block colors, like a logo or something designed in Illustrator, like we're going to use in a second. That's kind of a general rule, but we can see as we were looking at some of the different properties with our export window that that's not always going to hold true depending on various properties. So it's good to play around with it a little bit, but generally, you'll be able to use the defaults fine. Another thing to kind of consider is how big the image is for different contexts. When you upload an image somewhere, we can use the Open Lab as an example. If I go to the Open Lab and let's log in. Okay, if I go to my profile and I want to make a new, let's go to my settings. Let's say I want to change my avatar image. it's going to tell me some stuff. It's going to say you can use a JPEG, GIF, or PNG. And then when I upload the image, oops, I have to choose a file first. I'm not actually going to change this, but just as an example, let's say I wanted to upload this image. It's going to tell me I have to like crop a certain area. And it's going to change the size of the image essentially to be a square because that's what matches the design for the OpenLab. So I'm not actually going to do this. So let's go back to my portfolio for a second. You can see based on the general design, or sorry, let's go back to this one, profile. The basic design for this site is expecting a square image. And so if I upload a rectangle, it's going to ask me to cut out a square. And the image is generally going to be this size. And if I want to know what size this is, I can take a look in the inspector here, and I can see it's 225 by 225. So the majority of the time this image is being viewed on the internet, it's going to be this size, 225 by 225 pixels. So if I want to optimize my image for this particular context, I shouldn't make an image that's like, 10,000 pixels wide, because that's too much information for that space. So depending on the context, you want to, sometimes we need to know where the image is going to know what the best format is going to be. All right, so that's exporting. I'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we actually submit our assignment and upload it to the OpenLab, but I just wanted to do a quick overview this week. I'm going to stop the video here and then take questions.